Well, good evening and welcome to the Holland Land Office Museum. Tonight we've got our Director Ryan Duffy doing Joseph Ellicott's Ghost. It's a really unique program. I have been trying to get him to do this since he gave his presentation originally at the Buffalo History Museum. And it's been a while. So finally he's been motivated to do this. So I think you'll enjoy it. It's really got some unique information to it that we're living with every day and we don't think about. So it's always a pleasure to have, our own staff doing something that we can have a residual from. I just want to also mention that you can join the museum if you haven't already. We'd love to have you. The more the merrier. And also, I don't know if you're on the website or if you visited it or if you have an email address, you can give it to Ryan and he can keep you updated on events and various programs we're doing. So without any further hesitation, I'll give you our director, Ryan Duffy.
Thank you, Don. It's sort of odd being on the other end of that because I'm usually the one giving the introductions, so it's a little different. One quick thing to add, the guest speaker program, which I guess this technically is, even though I'm not a guest, but is actually funded partially through a DEC grant through New York State, which is provided by GoArt, so we want to make sure that we acknowledge them in helping us out being able to put this together. Which helps bring in people from farther afield than inside the museum, like myself. So, as Don mentioned, this program I did last year at the Buffalo History Museum. I was one of the first presenters they had back in person, though I still had to wear a mask for most of it, which made it really difficult, so I'm so happy I don't have to do that tonight. But it started because during the pandemic they were doing virtual presentations, and I did one for them called The Settlement of Western New York, talking about the early development. And they invited me back and said, but people want something more contemporary. So I came up with this topic of talking about the things that we experience every day or hear about every day or whatever that may be that actually go all the way back to the Holland Land Company. So I will apologize for anybody who was expecting ghost stories. I am not telling ghost stories, though Joe's ghost might be around, so don't say anything too negative about him. But I will not be getting into hauntings, but our next speaker next month will be, so stay tuned for that. But what kind of drove me towards this topic is, before I took this job 5 years ago, I've been to a lot of these places or heard of a lot of these things and had no idea where the name came from. And then once I got here, I started learning, oh, this is why this is called this. And this sort of became a little bit of a passion of mine, learning why things are called what they are and where did this name come from. So that's what kind of drove this presentation. And I'm going to go through a few different topics, kind of groupings of things. And if you guys have any questions at the end, we'll be happy to answer them about just about anything dealing with the Holland Land Company. I'll do my best to answer. So the first topic we're going to talk about is, if I turn on my clicker, there we go. So the counties of Western New York. So when the Holland Purchase came into being in 1797, and by 1800, all of this area was Genesee County. We were the sole county west of the Genesee River. Between 1800 and 1841, we went from 1 county to 8 counties. And really, the impetus for a lot of this comes right back to the land company. In fact, the original Genesee County had 4 towns in it. So about 5,000 square acres were broken into 4 towns. So you can imagine a town meeting being kind of hard to get to. So we had Batavia, we had Chautauqua, we had Erie, and Willink. So Batavia being the farthest east, Willink being in the middle, then Erie, then Chautauqua. So it was a different breakdown than we see today, but all those towns were made when Genesee County was made, right here in Batavia, actually. So how do we get from 1 county to 8? So as I mentioned, Genesee was the entire piece, but not for very long, as the first to break off or become its own was Allegheny County, which partially was settled during the Phelps-Gorham Purchase, which happened just before the Holland Purchase. So that was 1806. And then we went along the southern tier up until 1808. We had Cattaraugus and Chautauqua come in. And then we had Niagara County. Now, Niagara County was not just Niagara County, it was actually all of this to start. And then Erie County breaks off in 1821. So they just had their bicentennial, so they're still partying from that. And then eventually Orleans, and finally Wyoming. Now, Wyoming, you could sort of argue, comes about after the land company sort of starts to dissipate, but still was the last piece of the puzzle, you could say. Now, the development of the counties can really be traced back to the Holland Land Company, because eventually, once population started to spring up in these areas, a regional office, a county office was set up. So in places like Angelica, Ellicottville, Wellsville, Buffalo, Lockport, they all had offices of the Holland Land Company for their particular counties. And usually those became either population centers or even county seats in most regards, as that's where all the people were congregating. And also looking at the development of the counties, looking at their shapes, are very much determined by the survey that was done by Joseph Ellicott and the Land Company, as they're based around many natural features that were measured out. But a lot of the straight line boundaries that we see are because they're on survey lines of the land company. So that's why we get some very straight lines in places, but then we get some very jagged lines when the creeks and other natural boundaries come into play. So really, the Holland Land Company not just surveys the individual lots, but really lays out the general layout of everything that we call Western New York today. And there are a few parts in our counties of Western New York that are not included in this, at least initially. Anybody from the eastern part of Genesee County, technically not part of the Holland Land Purchase. It gets sort of enveloped through other sales, but starts to follow the same path. And the reason they're shaped that way is because that's how those purchases were laid out. So still follows the same concept, even if not dealing directly with the Holland Land Company. All right. Roads, everybody's favorite thing. Now, at this time, we're not dealing with potholes, we're just dealing with mud. So a little different, and just a little bit of a sidebar. Larry Barnes, the city historian, brought in a document to me yesterday that was written to James Stevens, who was the main clerk here for several decades. And it came from Albany, and it was about the building of a road from the Genesee River to Buffalo, which today is our main street. So the Holland Land Company is really responsible for the building of the first roads in Western New York, and they're the roads that we still travel every day. Now, there were paths here, Indian trails. Most of these follow that, but the major roads that we know today are all land office creations, really. So this is from 1804. So this is just after the purchase and sort of the initial building of the roads, though they were not much more than dirt paths at this point. They do get expanded over time. So Route 5, which is Main Street today, was actually two different roads. You had the Buffalo Road, which was from Buffalo to Batavia. And then you had the Genesee Road, which went all the way to the Genesee River there. And this is also the reason why a lot of these major now state or other roads come through Batavia, is because, well, guess where the headquarters were? Everybody had to get here, so that's where all the major roads come through, and still today. You have Big Tree Road here. This is Route 63 today. Goes down to Geneseo, which was called Big Tree at the time. You have the Middle Road, which is 20A today, which also connects Geneseo basically to Lake Erie. And then you had Oak Orchard, which is Route 98. And then you had 33 is the only one that's not really started yet, but you even have the Thruway, just called the Erie Road at this point, though it didn't quite go all the way across that way. But even parts of Route 86 in the southern tier and Route 19 going down the southern tier, all these places we can trace back to just about 1800. And they are the first highways of the day, and you can follow them along and usually find the major population points. All right. So reservation land. So we can say the not so nice side of our history here is the reservation system that was set up with the Treaty of Big Tree in 1797. And these reservations, or at least the ones that remain, are those same reservations. Now, the Treaty of Big Tree, just to give you a very basic understanding of it, was signed in 1797 between the Robert Morris family, the Seneca, and the Holland Land Company. And it was meant to extinguish the rights of the Seneca to the land that was to be sold to the Holland Land Company, so 3.25 million acres. And what transpired over a month's worth of arguments was that that land would be signed over to the land company from Morris, and the Seneca's rights would be extinguished. Now, they would be reserved 200,000 acres, so that's why we get the term reservation, which is something I did not know until more recently than I'd like to admit. So, but that is why they are called reservations. Now, the original treaty had 10 reservations throughout what we call the Holland Purchase. There were 6 along the Genesee River, which you can hopefully see a little bit here. And then you had 4 farther west. So here we've got the Tonawanda. This is the Buffalo Creek, the Cattaraugus, and the Allegheny. So down here is where Salamanca is. This is Silver Creek area. Buffalo Creek was basically all of Buffalo, and then obviously Tonawanda's here. And then we had, and these are always the ones that trip me up a little bit because a little less familiar, but you had Oil Springs down here. You had Gardeau, which is where Mary Jemison actually interjected herself into the arrangements and got herself her own reservation, which was actually the largest, quite a few thousand acres herself. So, and then you had Big Tree, Little Beardstown, and what's Avon today. I'm sort of blocking on the name, but give you an idea where those were. And now they are all gone. The only ones that are left are the Tonawanda, the Cattaraugus, and the Allegheny, and they are all much smaller than they were originally. And the largest of them all, the Buffalo Creek, was sold off completely in the 1840s. And this is where a lot of the major Native American chiefs ended up, such as Red Jacket, Mary Jemison ended up there, and they ended up dying there and being buried in, if anybody's familiar with South Buffalo, Indian Church Road, it's because there was an Indian church there. And that's where Red Jacket was originally buried. And when he died in 1830, he didn't stay buried very long. He was actually dug up by his followers, and they passed his body around from house to house because they were afraid that the white man would come and take him. This lasted for 40 years before eventually the white man did come and take him, and that's why he's buried in Forest Lawn today. But originally, he was on reservation land. So that's what makes Buffalo sort of hard, or at least the areas around Buffalo, hard to trace the property history all the way back, because for the first 40 years of its existence, it was not land company land, so it makes it a little bit more difficult. But those reservations, 1797, they're still here today. The only reservation in western New York that's not included in this is the Tuscarora up in Niagara County, up in this region. They came in a little bit later. But the other piece of property that I will point out, because it is a very interesting sort of piece of history, is what's called the mile strip, which was from Fort Niagara basically down to modern Buffalo today. And this was kept from the land company, and it was maintained by New York State as a means of national defense against those Canadian bothersome people that were bothering us at the time. But so this also explains the issue with Grand Island. I don't know if anybody remembers the several times that Grand Island came up in the news due to conflicts with treaties or Aboriginal rights. And that's because technically it was not included in the purchase, because the purchase ended at the river. So it really should have never changed hands, if you get very technical with it. But yeah, so that's why that was always sort of a bone of contention. But nobody wanted to listen. So yeah, so what we see as the reservation today gets its start all the way in 1797, and this sort of becomes kind of a benchmark for how things are done as they go farther west, though the Seneca are dealing more with the federal government in that case, but it does follow the same sort of pathway. And by the time the Buffalo Creek Reservation is sold off, actually the Seneca were supposed to be going out to Kansas altogether and be leaving western New York, but they fought back against that, and even in a Supreme Court case, were able to maintain the rights to the reservations here. So it could have looked even different, more different than it ended up. All right, so now we're going to get into individual locations. So we'll start out with Buffalo. Now, Buffalo existed before the Holland Land Company, at least what we call Buffalo. But it was nothing more than a basically backwoods camp with a few dozen people. Now, when the land company takes over, Buffalo actually changes its name to New Amsterdam. Only lasts a couple of years and they change it right back, but for a while it was called New Amsterdam. But the names that we associate with Buffalo, at least the downtown streets, were all directly connected to the Holland Land Company. First off, Joseph Ellicott is the one who lays this out. And coming from the Ellicott School of City Design, it's a spoken wheel pattern, just like Washington, D.C. For those who may not know, his older brother Andrew, who taught him everything about surveying, is the one who finished laying out Washington, D.C., and Joseph actually helped him with that. So you can see the sort of the inspiration here. But if you've ever been on Elmwood Avenue and it gets kind of jockey with the corners, well, that's because that's where Black Rock and Buffalo meet. Black Rock was laid out in a grid pattern. So when a spoken wheel meets a grid, it doesn't always match up real well. So that's why Elmwood's kind of funky getting into. But the other reason I wanted to talk about this is from 1805, that you might not be able to read it real well, but those roads we all know in downtown Buffalo were not called the same thing that they are today. They were actually all named after the investors of the Holland Land Company. So let's see, what we got? Well, we have Bust Ave, which still exists in Buffalo, but that's named after Paolo Busti. We had to anglicize that for it. He also had Bust Terrace, so he had two. Let's see, let me make sure I get all these right. So let's start with Van Staphorst. Where is he? I know you're here somewhere. There he is. So Van Staphorst was named after Nicholas Van Staphorst, and that's South Main Street today. A little easier to say. Then we had Schimmelpenninck Avenue, which I'm very glad they changed. I don't think it could actually fit on a sign. This was named after he has the best name, Rutger von Schimmelpenninck. I've had to practice that one, but it's one of my favorites. That's Niagara Street today, so this would be Schimmelpenninck Square then. And then we have Vollenhoven Avenue, which is Erie Street today. And then we also had Staninsky and Cazenovia, and I'm not sure which ones they are today specifically, but if we looked at a modern map, we could figure that out. And also Cazenovia Terrace. So you can look at all of these, and Willink here as well. So every single major member of the Holland Land Company had a street in Buffalo, but oddly enough, not Ellicott. And he's the only one basically left with a street named after him. So, but he owned most of the land, so he could call it probably whatever he wanted to in the end. But that was, so they made all those names in honor of basically their Dutch overlords who had all the money controlling the land. So, but by within about 30 years, they all go to change to Native American names for the most part, and you can see sort of the inspiration with Onondaga Street and Mohawk, so they just kind of continue with that theme. So Buffalo is one of those accomplishments, but we have to talk about Batavia. Now, Batavia does not exist before the Holland Land Company. It is founded by Ellicott when he comes here in 1801, and he lays out early Batavia. So basically all the area right around us is the first part that he develops in Batavia. So again, we've got Buffalo Street, which is West Main, because it goes to Buffalo. You'll see a pattern of why things. Then you have Genesee Street, which is East Main Street, because it goes to the Genesee River eventually. Big Tree Road, which is Ellicott Street today, because it went to Big Tree. That's Route 63. Court Street, because, hey, the courthouse was there. Makes sense, right? And Jackson, that's just named after some guy, because Andrew Jackson isn't even a real major player yet. And same thing with a few of the others. Now, Cemetery Street, Sharon, you'll know, because that's where the cemetery was, so eventually. And then Tonawanda, because it ran along the Tonawanda Creek. Now, for some reason, they kept sticking Buffalo Road because, well, we had to have two Buffalo Roads because we couldn't be too technical. And 98 called Elba Street. I wonder why. So at the very beginning, street names were not very original. Where do they go? That's what they're called. So, but as you can see, this layout is basically still the same in Batavia. It's changed somewhat, but you recognize a lot of these streets where they're laid out. And this goes all the way back to our very beginning. And look at that, Stevens Street is named after the guy I mentioned, James Stevens. So everybody got their play. Let's see. But of course, now in Batavia, you still see some of those with Ellicott having two streets named after him. But oddly enough, that's kind of where it's ended with names directly related to the land company, but Ellicott was still responsible for setting up a lot of these places. All right, so now we're going to move into townships and property limits, because all of these, even today, some of them have not changed since the land company set them up back in 1800. So, for instance, my hometown of Eden, which is this one right here, it's still the same square. And so looking back at those records, pretty easy to follow along. Now, Ellicott had his lotting system that he set up, and this actually ended up being sort of the inspiration for the Northwest Ordinance, which comes about around the same time. Uses a very similar system, though the sizes are a little different. So when we're looking at the Ellicott system, along the bottom are your ranges. So from east to west, 1 to, I believe, 18. And then from north to south are your townships, which is 1 to 16 at the very top. And so if you were looking for any property, they would use those as their coordinates. So for instance, Eden is 8-8. Just made it even easier. And Batavia is 212 if you're ever looking for Batavia. And then you can kind of go around from there. And this is what your average township looked like. So the average township would have 64 lots of approximately 120 acres each. Obviously today a lot is not 120 acres, so it's been broken down many times since then. So initially Ellicott said, okay, we're going to have 6 by 6 square mile townships with 64 lots in them. Started getting a little bit tough to follow, so they put sections in. So then they would break it down into sometimes 8 sections, sometimes more, depending on how many they had. And that way they would say range, township, section, lot. So you had 4 numbers to keep track of to find your property. And it worked pretty well for the most part. And a lot of those lots, the lotting system was kept well until the 20th century. However, today it's a lot different with municipal lotting and the breakdowns of especially urban lotting and all of that. But it can all be traced back this far, and you can still, if you've got the original lot number, you can probably still find it on the map roughly using that. And that's all basically due to Joseph Ellicott. So if you've got your deed, and it does go all the way back, Holland Land Company is the first one on that list. And if you're really good, you might have the second person, and then that's your first purchaser. So that's your original owner of that land, and who knows how long they keep it from there. However, not every deed has that, so a lot of times you get the abstract, and it only goes back, 80 years. Got a big gap to fill in there, but it can be done. Now, this layout, this lotting system gets a little tricky when we talk about Buffalo, because Ellicott changed it up for Buffalo because that was sort of the only populous center. So the lots are very much different. They don't follow the same pattern. So when you look for property in Buffalo, it's a whole nother ballgame. But for 95% of Western New York, it follows this system. So now we'll talk about Joseph Ellicott himself and what's in a name. So before I get too far into it, I'll talk about the name of Batavia and why we're called Batavia. So we're called Batavia because of the Dutch. Ellicott wanted to name something in sort of reference to the Holland Land Company. And Batavia is actually a Dutch word, or a Dutch origin, which means good land. Not a bad choice. And it's actually a region in the Netherlands. And in fact, around the time that the Holland Land Company is putting its money out there, Holland is not an independent nation. It's under the control of France and is actually called the Republic of Batavia. But Batavia, and actually Batavia can even be traced back to the Romans, as they called the people who settled in what are now the Netherlands, the Batavia. So that's where we get the term Batavia. And Batavia, as I said, was not the original choice. Ellicott wanted to name it after Paolo Busti. So he wanted to call it Boostiville. I think we all have the right reaction to that. And Paolo Busti said, no. He said, Joe, name it after yourself. So they almost went with Ellicottown. They didn't like that either, so they settled on Batavia. But oddly enough, we were not the first Batavia, New York. There was a Batavia, New York down on the Hudson Valley there, sort of left over from the old Dutch colonization, though it was basically not a center of population, it was just a post office. So the original post office for Batavia, you had to mail it to Genesee County. I'm just throwing a lot of extra information out here, so. But Joseph, he doesn't get Batavia, but he gets Ellicottville. So I think he did pretty well in that. He's also got Ellicott Ave, Ellicott Street, Ellicott Square, Ellicott Creek. Anything named Ellicott, pretty much named after him. So he's remembered, but I think people don't realize who it's named after, but they know the name Ellicott for sure. And it's not just here in Western New York where you can find his name. His family was originally from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, but settled in Maryland in a place called Ellicott Mills, named after his father. So today there's still Ellicott Mills, Maryland. And they call me occasionally because they'll get a portrait in and they don't know which Ellicott it is. So I have to try to figure that out. But yes, Joseph Ellicott still has plenty of things named after him. Theophilus Cazenove, he was the first general agent of the land company. He was a Dutchman, sort of a banker, womanizer, partier, which is why he's called the original and not the only general agent. But anything named Cazenovia is named after him. So you have Cazenovia, New York, out near Syracuse. And the reason that's called that is actually Cazenove set up an office out there sort of as an auxiliary office in order to get people to come this way. And then we have Cazenovia Creek, which, like Cazenove, doesn't work very often. So if you know, it jams every winter. So, and then we've got Mr. Boosty, and we know him as Bust-Eye. So you have Bust-Eye Ave still, and Bust-Eye, New York. So he got his town too, so never fear. And I've talked to people from Bust-Eye, and they had no idea that it really should have been called Boosty. So, Boosty, yes. All right. Now we'll get into some structures, some physical things that we see today. Obviously, where we are today, this is the leading landmark left over. Now, it operated, it was built in 1815 as the regional office for the Holland Land Company. So even though they might have had an office in each county, everything had to come back here to Batavia, and this is where Joseph Ellicott worked, as well as many others. And it operated roughly until 1845 in that capacity, and then was still a land office up until 1860, though it was owned by other companies. Then for 20 years, it was actually a school. This was Mrs. Bryan's seminary. This was their schoolhouse. And then it was the Free Methodist Church. And then it was an apartment building until 1893 when the Historical Society takes over, and it's basically been that way ever since. But this is sort of what it looked like originally. It was very much a country building, and as you walk back through the building, where the gift shop begins, that's where the original back of it was. And there was no retaining wall at that time, so you got to believe it flooded quite often, as the creek almost ran right back up to the back door. But this is really the landmark that's left dealing with the Holland Land Company. Anybody been down to Mayville and seen this structure? Yes. So this is the Mayville office vault. So this was the stone vault for the Holland Land office in Mayville, so the Chautauqua County one. The office was burned to the ground in February 11th, 1836 by a group of angry farmers who wanted to expunge all record of their debts. This is actually the most infamous part of what's called the Land Office War, where after the land company tried to increase their collection methods, people fought back. And they thought, hey, what's the best way to get rid of the records? Let's just burn the building to the ground. However, they didn't realize that everything had been duplicated and sent to Batavia already, so they didn't get rid of anything. But that is part of the reason why this building was built out of stone, because they were so deathly afraid of fire. And at least the stone building could survive structurally, that they could rebuild it. And that's why the stone vault still exists. And this is right in front of the county building down in Mayville, so you can still see it today. Next to the site of the former Peacock Mansion, William Peacock ran the office, and his home was right next door. So, and I don't know if anybody's been on UB South Campus. If you've ever recognized this building and wondered what it was, it is actually a scale replica of our building here. And it was built in the 1930s. Now, I didn't realize this, but growing up, I actually had a connection to this building. My father worked on the UB South campus in the building right next door to this. So for about 10 years, I walked by this building many, many times and had no idea why it looked the way it did. And I come here and, oh, there it is. That's the mini version. So yes, if you ever are on Main Street in Buffalo and you just happen to go by the campus, just check it out because it's a perfectly scale replica of this building. When this picture was taken, it was the Dean of Nursing's office. I don't know if it still is, but you can't fit much in there for sure. So, but yes, it is actually a replica. For some reason, they wanted to make some connection to the growth of Buffalo, so they picked this version of it. So, and it's Beck Hall now, so look for Beck Hall. It's like no other building on campus, so you can miss it if you're not looking, but it's tucked away in a corner.
Going back to that, she talked about the bunker in the previous.
Yep.
Okay. Does that still contain any records?
No, it is. There, to my knowledge, there is nothing in there. It is not weatherproofed in any way, so you would not want to keep any paper in there at all. But it's more of just a landmark now. All right. So before I get into this part, we've all used these in school. This is another piece of history that we can see as a remnant of the Holland Land Company, because we actually have Joseph Ellicott to thank for this. Before Ellicott did his survey, he was looking for a standardized unit of measurement, and what we had was a foot. But that was not a standard unit of measurement. A foot at that time was supposed to be the king's foot. We didn't even have a king anymore, so I don't know who you're supposed to use except whatever foot you had available. So what Mr. Ellicott did is he lined up all the feet he could find, and he took the average. And that's why we have 12 inches. That's why it's not 10, like a nice simple number. No, it had to be 12. So what he did is for all of his workers, all 150 of them, he made a brass 12-inch ruler. If any of those have survived, I'd love to see one, but we are also the home of the 12-inch ruler. And Mr. Ellicott also measured the height of Niagara Falls. He was the first person to do that. So it was a lot of rulers. But moving on to sort of the last way we kind of interact is tracing our property records, where we actually get to use those records and make them meaningful. Today, we actually have some original records, not all of them. Many people like to think we have all the original records. Unfortunately, we don't. But we do have the original ledgers for every township in Erie County, which is pretty fascinating because you can get right down to the very beginning. And so I had to do my hometown. So this is Eden. So this is what Eden looked like before it was actually Eden, even called anything. And you can see all the individual lots, and they have a page number on the map, and you take that and you go to the ledger, and there you go. You can find the people. These are actually the first settlers in Eden. So this is the very beginning. And it tells you how many acres, what lot number, when they purchased it, and how much they paid. And then eventually how much they paid off or didn't pay off in some cases. And it's very interesting to see how properties changed hands, how long people had it for, how many times it reverted back to the land company because people couldn't pay it off. And, but there are several other places that have these original records. We happen to have these because the Erie County clerk didn't want them and sent them back to us. But these were sitting in the basement of the clerk's office. So, but interacting with the records in other ways, if you go to your county clerk's office, sometimes they have them. There's other places that have them. SUNY Fredonia has all of the original records on microfilm. It was done back in the 80s as a state project. We have Land Transactions of Western New York by Karen Livesey. And these are also digitized online. So if you know the name of the person you're looking for, these are great because it'll give you the dates and the location. But if you don't have a name, they're practically useless. So make sure you have a name first. Let's see. If you go to the Buffalo History Museum, the Glowacki collection has oodles of paperwork dealing with the Holland Land Company. Not all of it very useful, but at least it's interesting. But they also have other papers related to the early development of our area. Local historical societies have some things. I also included a few other books that at least we have. The Holland Land Company, which was written in 1924 by, get his name right, Paul Evans. This was actually done as a series by the Buffalo History Museum. So they actually have some copies of it, but if you can get your hands on this, is a very good one going back. We've got Joseph Ellicott and Stories of the Holland Land Purchase. So this is interesting if you're looking to understand what Joseph Ellicott was thinking, because it's all a lot of his letters, especially during the War of 1812, very interesting. Joseph Ellicott and the Holland Land Company, this is sort of my go-to tome of finding things out. And this one we actually sell in the bookstore, so little plug there, wink, wink. And then we have the pioneer history of the Holland Land Purchase, which will go all the way back to prehistoric times, which if you want to get into that, that's fine, but it goes through the entire history of the Holland Purchase. And this was written in the 1850s, actually, so it's pretty close to the time when the land office was still here, and goes through a lot of the major people and places and all of that. So there's still plenty of resources out there. A lot of it's just older, and you have to sort of dig a little bit through that. Let's see, and I guess that's the end of it. So I'll take any questions on anything that's tickling your mind.
Just a curiosity.
Sure.
The average length of a foot was that 12 inches?
Apparently that's what it came out to. So.
That's big, because back then people were smaller.
So I'm thinking that it wasn't just a person's foot. I think there was some sort of extra thing added on to. Yes. So what I said, he took the average of the feet he had. I think that was also what other people had measured it as, not just actual feet. So, because there were other attempts at creating rulers, and they weren't. It's just he was the one who came up with 12, and that's what stuck. So, yes.
So he came up with the inch first?
The inch was already established.
Oh, it was?
Yes. In fact, the foot was already a unit of measurement. It just was not a standardized unit of measurement. So, yes, sir.
Are there stone markers around?
Yes, that's another thing. That's one thing I forgot to mention. Occasionally, if you go out in the woods, you can actually find some of these markers along the transit lines. But the two most important are at the end of the meridian, which was the first line measured. Since they knew, so through Western New York, there's one major line of longitude. I believe it's the 77th meridian. I could be wrong on that, but it runs basically right through the center of the purchase. That's where they started the surveying, and they went straight up all the way through and then branched out from there because they knew where that line was supposed to be. So there are two major markers, one on each end. So the northern end, which was on the Lake Ontario shore, it's no longer on the Lake Ontario shore because where the shoreline was is not a shoreline anymore. So it's where we can see erosion happening because where it was is now out in the lake. But at the Newfane Historical Society, you can find that rock, and it's a large rock. It's out in front of their historical society. Now the southern one is actually in Allegheny State Park. It is at the Quaker Museum, not the Red House, the Quaker one. And you can see that, again, that was just out in the wilderness actually, and it wasn't, where they originally put it was not quite on the PA border, so it actually wasn't perfectly correct. What they found is when they went back and did surveying is that when they did the the southern boundary along Pennsylvania is it started to move. And when they surveyed it, and we're off by as much as 90 miles in some places. So it just proves if you start off wrong, you're going to keep going wrong. But you can even find markers in sort of very random places. There used to be a marker right at the courthouse here. Whatever happened to that, I don't know, but it was there. And to add to that, are we all familiar with Transit Road? Has anybody ever thought why it's called Transit Road? Because that is the transit line. So that's why it's called Transit Road. I drove on that transit road for my entire life, never thought about why it's called transit. I thought, oh, it's just very busy, so it's like a transit, like a lot of people go on. No, it goes all the way back to the Holland Land Company. So
Transit Road in Stafford?
both. Well, Transit Road in Orchard Park, going up through there, but also Transit Road in Stafford, named for the same reason. That is the eastern boundary of the original purchase. So, yes, they're both called Transit Road for the same reason. Just one's a lot more known than the other. All right.
So kind of like the average plot of land the Holland Land Office would sell, like say like a private individual, how much would that be in terms of acres?
About 120. Obviously, it could vary widely, but that's what a lot was. So you didn't have to buy a whole lot, but that's what a lot was. So most people usually bought close to a lot, about 100 acres or so, but you would see 60 to, some people would buy 1,000 acres if they could, or 300. So, and the average price per acre was about $2.50. So an average lot was about $300. A lot of money, and a lot of people never paid that off. But yes, that's what you were looking at. So, any other questions?
Yeah, where is Mayville?
So Mayville is on the western end of Chautauqua Lake. So the opposite end from Jamestown. That is where the county seat is. Yeah. Yep, it's right on the lake, though.
There's something I read that said, traveling from Philadelphia, where the Holland Land Company was located, you could go by boat to Albany, stagecoach to Canandaigua, and horse.
Yes.
If you could find it.
Basically, well, there's a couple different ways, but that was probably the most well-known way. But you could also take the river systems through Pennsylvania and end up kind of at Elmira today, and then make your way through the roads that way if you wanted to. But yeah, so there were different ways, but that would be the posh way of going because it was more comfortable for sure. But they actually sent a lot of people up through the central Pennsylvania essentially too. Yes?
Ellicott, his family settled in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Do you have any idea when that would have been? Maybe?
So Ellicott was born there in Bucks County, and he was born in 1760. They moved to Ellicott Mills sometime in the latter stages of the 18th century. But Ellicott and his brothers really set up in Philadelphia once they have their business interest, I guess you could say. But the family starts there, but then moves into Maryland when some opportunities open up. So I don't know specifically how long they were there for, but several decades for sure. So.
The reason I ask is because my family originated in Bucks County, Pennsylvania in 1684.
Okay.
So it might be around the same time.
I think they're a little bit later, but early 1700s, I could probably guess they start being in there. Yes. Joseph Ellicott's father, Joseph, was a well-known clockmaker, actually. So if you go to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, you can see a very tall grandfather clock, actually made by a Joseph Ellicott. Not our Joseph Ellicott, but his father. So there's another little connection. And he built a lot of clocks before down in both Bucks County and in Maryland. So, yes.
Earlier, we had some visitors admiring our Ellicott display. They asked a question.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm asking a question. How many more Ellicotts left? And if so, do they come back this way?
I'm sure there are. Where they are, actually, let me change that. A few years ago, we met a lady who was a descendant of Andrew Ellicott. She lives in Churchville. Now, one Ellicott's line, or Andrew's line, actually settled in Orleans County. And I guess there's still a few around, but not many. And besides that one lady, I have never run into any others. So if they're around, they're not coming back here, at least not right now. So, no, I haven't gotten them to join, you know. Yes.
Is the town of Evans named after the family that moved with him?
Yes. So the town of Evans, which is in on the shoreline of Erie County there. So the Evans family is one of those families that's very close with the Ellicotts as well as the Browns because they all intermarried. So one of Joseph's sisters, Rachel, marries Lewis Evans, and they have a son, David Ellicott Evans, who eventually moves up here with his mother and follows in Joseph's footsteps and actually becomes the resident agent here and moves into the Ellicott Mansion, which was across the street from us here. And, but yes, the Evans is named after that family.
Where are they buried?
So you can find most of the Ellicotts that came up here in our own historic Batavia cemetery. In the back corner there, we have a nice big monument there to Joseph with Benjamin and Rachel to the side there. They're buried in the same plot since they were twins. Is there anybody else, Sharon? The Evans are there too. Most of them are, at least. But yeah, so you can still go talk to Joe if you want. He's probably still hanging out there. But yeah, so though that's not originally where Joseph was buried, as he died in New York City under some tragic circumstances. But he was only there a short time before the family moved the body back up here to Batavia, to his not ancestral home, but where he really became everything. So, yes?
What happened to him?
So, it seems like all of our famous figures have a tragic ending, I guess. It's just par for the course. But so, Joseph Ellicott was forced to resign from his position here in 1821 for various reasons, many of them political. And I think one way to describe Joseph very well is to call him a workaholic. He had no wife or children, and I really think this position was really what he saw himself as. And within a few short years, it seems he had some sort of mental breakdown, was suffering from some disease that's been mentioned, dementia maybe, or I've even heard syphilis. But he was having some mental difficulties, and the family actually sent him to an insane asylum in New York City. And in 1826, he hung himself in his cell. And that's why he was buried he was actually buried in a Quaker cemetery in New York City and then was eventually brought back up here. So. He was well, I'm sure he's been around somewhere, so. All right, well, thank you. All right, so before I let you leave, just a few announcements. Our next guest speaker will be July 13th, and it is Mason Winfield, who is a very well-known paranormal researcher, historian from East Aurora. He'll be coming out here to give us his top 13 paranormal stories from Genesee County. So very cool to have him here for that. Then July 21st is our next trivia night, and we'll be doing it on Apollo 11 on the moon landing. And then July 28th is the next Java with Joe, and we have David D'Amico coming, and he's going to be talking about early recorded music and the Edison cylinder player, record player. So he's actually got several different versions, and he'll be showing those off as well. So that'll be very interesting. So feel free to come by for any of those. Everything is up on our website, on our Facebook page. If you join up on the email list, you'll be seeing all those as well. So look for that.
Trivia nights at the
No,
Batavia Club?
no, not this month. The next months are, but no, not for July, but for August and September they will be. But yes, we'll be trying them at a different site. So going down the road in August, we'll be doing it on Woodstock, and it'll actually be at Go Art. So that way, if you want to play some trivia, you can go have a beer as well. So you can enjoy that. And also for September, which will be on Elizabeth the 1st, and we'll be doing it there as well. So yeah, so if you'd like a new venue for it, you can check that out, and that way you can also check out what's going on at Go Art as well at the same time. So other than that, thank you all for coming out and listening to me for a while. And any questions afterwards, you can always email me, and I'll be happy to answer to my best of my ability. So.